Hello, and thanks for joining us once again. Luiz Lima here, broadcasting from Orlando, Florida. You are on Kardec Radio, and this is Spiritism, a closer look. Once again, we broadcast every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So, for tonight, we are going to take a closer look at suffering or sufferings. Nobody likes that. It's something that we don't like on us, and we don't like to see people suffering, but it's just part of life. So we want to take a closer look at this thing, what's behind it, and how can we just get around it and not suffer so much or not suffer at all. To begin with, I'm just going to say that suffering, regardless how much and how, it's always a reaction to something that we have done. It has to do with how we perceive the reactions to our past actions. And it's not the same for everyone. Some situation can take place. For example, you can be with a couple of people around you, let's say a small group of 4 or 5 people, and there's a certain situation that causes me, for example, to go into this suffering stage, even if it's temporarily for a few minutes, maybe for an hour or two. So, whatever happens, I can place myself in this state of suffering, and none of the other people around me will feel anything. Whatever the situation is, it doesn't have the same meaning for them. So, for the same event, for the same, I'm just going to say, stimulus, people have different reactions. The perception is different. What makes the perception be different? Basically, the spiritual history. Who we are today, what brought us here today, makes us have our own filters. So, certain situations might trigger suffering for some, and the very same situation might not trigger suffering for others, because it depends. It's a personal thing. It depends on each one of us. So, because of the law of action and reaction, suffering is always how we react to something that we have done. And why do we see so much suffering around on the planet, all of around the planet, everywhere? It's not your city, it's not your country, it's not your hemisphere, it's everywhere. In different levels, in different grades and graduations, but suffering is basically everywhere on the planet. And why is that? Well, the earth is a house. The earth houses suffering spirits. That's what it is for. It's a planet of trials and expiations. So it houses spirits that have to undergo trials and expiations, and that can again, depending on how we see, how we perceive these trials and expiations, it can trigger suffering in us. So the earth it has that purpose. Now, think about, for example, in a city, we have several hospitals in the city. So if you go to a hospital, it doesn't make any sense to ask, why do we have so many or so much illness here? Because the hospital has that purpose to receive people, who are ill, and they will be taken care of. So it's the same for the earth. Why do we have so much suffering on earth? Because that's what the earth is for. Like hospitals in the city, also, we have many of them. And depending on the nature and the gravity of the illness, one hospital might be more appropriated than the other. Not better, just more appropriate. It's more, it can sustain better that type of patient with that illness. Same for the earth. For the type of spirits that are here, the Earth is not the only trials and expiations planet, but it's the most adequate for the level that we are, the level of advancement, moral and intellectual advancement. So, do we see a lot of suffering around? Yes. Do we like it? No, not at all. So, what can we do? The Spirits book has several questions about it, and we are going to take a few of them. Allan Kardec has a sequence of 6 or 7 questions about it. So, I'm going to take some of them. That's towards the end of the book, the last part. Question 1003, 1003. The question is the duration, so that's an interesting question about the duration. How long? Is the duration of the sufferings of the guilty in the future life arbitrary or subordinate to some law? Is it arbitrary or subordinate to some law? The Spirits answered just like this: God never capriciously acts. God never acts capriciously. And everything in the universe is ruled by laws that reveal the divine wisdom and goodness. So it's not something arbitrary how long it's going to take. It has laws, it has a logically balanced system in place, which is, by the way, governed by the supreme intelligence, God. So there's a logic behind it. It's not something that, yeah, it's going to be more suffering for you and less for that person. They did the same thing, but it's going to take you more time than for you, than for him, for her. There is no such a thing. So we are responding to the law. We are facing reactions to something already in place, the law of God. And then he goes to the next question, 1004. What determines the duration of the sufferings of the guilty? Very interesting question. How long am I going to suffer for? Basically, that's the question. How long are we going to suffer for? Answer: the length of time that is required for our improvement. The length of time that is required for the improvement of the spirit or spirits. And it continues: since the state of suffering or happiness, you see, one or the other, right? Since the state of the suffering or happiness is in proportion to a spirit's degree of purification, the duration and nature of its sufferings depend on the time it takes to improve itself. So how long does it take? The time that it takes me to improve myself. And it continues: as the spirit progresses and its sentiments become purer, its sufferings diminish and are changed to the same extent. So it takes as long as it takes me to get better. So there is nothing preset. You're going to suffer for 10 years, for 3 incarnations. No. It's up to me to decide. I am the one deciding on my own sentence, if you will. And then the next question is even more interesting. 1006. Question is, can the duration of a spirit's suffering be eternal? Meaning, can it last forever? Answer: of course, if it were to remain eternally evil. That is to say, if it were never to repent or improve itself, it would suffer then eternally. However, that's part of the answer. However, God has not created beings eternally devoted to evil. He has not. They were only created simple and ignorant, and all of them must progress over a longer or shorter period of time according to their own free will. So if we put these three questions and answers together, all together, all in one, it's very simple. Depending on how we react to the facts of life, we are going to suffer more or less. Once we are facing the suffering process, it will take as long as I want. It's called free will. There won't be a letter in the mail, a divine letter in the mail saying, your suffering is about to end. As of tomorrow morning, you don't suffer anymore. There is no such a thing. It's not divine decree that decides on that. It's us. It's me. It's you. Each one of us. We decide on how long we want to suffer for. If we like it, yeah, we'll keep going. And complaining, of course, but we'll keep going. One day we're going to say, stop it. That's it. That's it. I can't take this anymore. I can't do this anymore. I'm changing as of now, or maybe next life, if we're planning for a next life. And that will be the time where we stop the suffering. But it's on us. It's our free will. And the answer to this continues. I'm just going to read it to you. This will, the free will, the willing to change, right? Willingness to change. This will can be belated to various degrees, just as there are children who are precocious to various degrees. Sooner or later, however, it will manifest itself by the irresistible need the spirit feels to leave its state of imperfection and to be happy. Meaning there's something inside each one of us telling us that we cannot resist forever and ever. There's going to be a point where we are going to surrender to advancing morally. But it depends on us. And the answer continues. The law that governs the duration of suffering is therefore eminently wise and beneficent. It subordinates that duration to the spirit's own efforts, never depriving it of its free will. Again, free will. We have free will. If it makes a bad use of it, if it makes a bad use of free will, you will have to bear the consequences. So you see, all of this thing takes us back to free will, which in turn takes us back to responsibility. We are fully responsible for creating the situations, going through the situations, receiving the reaction from nature somehow, undergoing that until we are ready to leave all that behind. We don't want any suffering anymore. So we don't plant what makes us suffer anymore. And what makes us suffer? What do we plant that makes us suffer? Acts of imperfect spirits, vices and, selfishness, and the list is long. It goes on and on and on. Pride, intolerance, impatience, and so and so. Now, the Spirit Lacordaire in the Gospel according to Spiritism, he has a very interesting saying, a very interesting instruction. And briefly, just, the concept is this. He will tell us that we should suffer. We are here suffering. We should suffer well. And he says, few people suffer well. Hold on. What is suffer well? Is a combination of things. But ultimately, we're going to talk about it. But ultimately is I have to suffer, period. I can't change it because it's a reaction to something I did. So let me understand the situation because this has been absolutely horrible. Suffering is not fun. I don't like it. I don't want to go through this again. If I don't want to go through this again, I don't want to plant the same seeds. So there is action required on my part, which is understand why. Oh, okay, I did this thing, whatever, 10 years ago or 2 lifetimes ago. I'm not going to do this anymore. So it needs understanding, comprehend the situation, but it needs action towards not doing it again, doing different. We need a different outcome. We need to act differently. If we keep acting the same way, suffering is going to go on and on and on, and the outcome is already known, and I don't like it. So how do we avoid it? Knowledge. Understand the situation. Spiritism is here as a tool to explain this clearly. It's not gray area, it's clear explanation of why. If we read the first 5 books of Spiritism, the codification, it's all in there in detail. Of course, we have a lot of other instructions and books that came after that. But this is the start of everything. This is the starting point. Suffering is something that is personal and cannot be transferred. I cannot suffer for somebody else. So it takes the burden out of them. And nobody can suffer for me, so it takes the burden out of me. There is no such a thing. Now, one thing that becomes interesting is, and we spoke about this several times here already, illnesses are consequences of wrongdoings. Basically, it's the imperfection of the spirit that indirectly causes illnesses. So think about this, for example. If you have an illness, some sort of illness that is, let's just put it, not necessarily very, very serious, but significant. So if you suffer something like this, one way to not revert the situation, but one way in which it's going to be our starting point, so we don't do this anymore, is use our knowledge towards other. What knowledge do we have if we suffer, if we have a certain illness? The knowledge is the experience. We are experienced, or we have been experiencing this particular illness for a few years, maybe decades. So we have been experienced. We know exactly what it is. We know how much it makes us suffer, physical pain at times, and just the process itself. So we have experience. We are getting to be experts on this thing. If I have that knowledge and that experience, I am in a position to help others with the same illness. So I can serve God by going to help other people with the same thing because I got the experience and I'm becoming an expert on that. That's very interesting because think about this. If you have an illness, again, something significant, and you keep thinking on that all the time, oh my God, I'm going through this, I'm going through this, I'm going through this. We are narrowing our focus in life only to that. So there's going to be a point where we stop our lives, we don't do anything anymore. That's it. Now, if I use this to go out somewhere, to a hospital, to a person's house, someone who is facing the same thing that we are, and we can use our experience towards helping that person, during the time that I am helping that person, and that could be being there for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, during that time, I'm not focusing on my own illness. My focus is out of my illness and it's on helping others using my knowledge, almost like quotes please ability, because I know this thing. I've been going through this. So the things that we face in the world today, they're all consequences of anything that we did. So we complain, for example, that we don't like people in power. We don't like this and that. People are corrupt. They don't have moral standards. To the point that I like to. Well, think about this. Why do we have so much of that? Why do we have so much corruption, for example? Because in the past we sustained that kind of behavior. Maybe we don't do this anymore if we have advanced to a point that corruption is, out of my mind. I'm never going to do this anymore. But there was a time that we sustained this thing. And now I'm not going to say payback time, but it's time to offset. So we are experiencing the reaction to that. It's all action and reaction. And to end up and to wrap up today's talk, I'm going to read a text that was dictated by Spirit Albino Texera. It is about suffering, but it's very interesting the way he conveys the message. So I'm just going to read it to you. What we suffer most in the world, and then there's a list. It is not the difficulty, it's the discouragement in overcoming it. It's not the ordeal, it is the despair in the face of suffering. It's not the disease, it's the dread of receiving it. It's not the unfortunate relative, it's the heartache of having him on the family team. It's not failure, it's the stubbornness of not recognizing one's mistakes. See, it's the other side of everything. It's not ingratitude, it is the inability to love without selfishness. It's not smallness itself, it's the revolt against the superiority of others. It's not the insult, it's the wounded pride. It's not the temptation, it's the voluptuousness of trying out someone's suggestions. It's not the old age of the body, it's the passion for appearances. Great text. Great text. Once I was in a show, in a concert. I was in a music concert. And at one point, the singer comes to the microphone in between songs. And she says, she talks about herself a little bit and, how things were difficult in the beginning of her life and her career. Several, things she had to overcome, like most of us. And she would say this phrase, and this thing stick to my mind to a point that I still remember it today. That was several years ago, many, many years ago. She says, I'd rather fail on my own terms than succeed on somebody else's. You take this home and you think about this. It's absolutely awful. That makes us suffering. If you are a person to be able to tell us this, Can you imagine the amount of suffering she had to go through and try to overcome? Thank you so much once again for participating with us tonight. Luiz Lima here, broadcasting from Orlando, Florida. Spiritism, a closer look. We'll be back next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So I'll see you then. Stay well.